What's good? What's good, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of The Urban Platform Speaks. Make sure to like and subscribe as you tune into the channel. Check out the content. And with that being said, man, I want to speak on Chris Paul because, as you probably know, Chris Paul has been he's been trending lately because the Clippers, the Los Angeles Clippers, um, recently just sent Chris Paul home, right? And so you have a lot of people feeling bad for Chris Paul, which uh I don't know if I really feel bad for him. I just think that this is a situation that Chris Paul created, right? But the thing about it is, and what I want to say about the situation is when people talk about like great point guards and they kind of contribute like Chris Paul being a great point guard, great point guard because he's been around for 20 years. And in my opinion, just longevity don't qualify you as being a great point guard. He's a really good point guard in my opinion. I think just like Mike Conley. Who does Mike Conley play for? Mike Conley play for Minnesota Timberwolves, right? He's and Mike Conley has been around for a long time too, right? But that don't mean that Mike Conley is like historically great. And I don't think that Chris Paul is historically great, right? I think he's probably a better than average point guard. And so that's why I wanted to talk about like compare him to what I think like a true point guard, like somebody like a Drew Holiday, right? Because people forget like what a point guard, what their job is, and that's why I want to use Drew Holiday as an example, right? Because as a point guard, you are basically you're the floor general, right? And you're there to make sure you're the bridge between the coach and your teammates that are on the floor. And it's the point guard's job to run the offense, recognize like mismatches and stuff like that on the court. Also, if you're the leader, the team leader, the point guard should inspire, motivate, and do all that stuff. But a lot of what I'm hearing about Chris Paul, and it's no secret that Chris Paul was somebody who's difficult to get along with, and he's very demanding. So for him to be like the way he was with his teammates, to me that wasn't leadership. Like I said, his job as a point guard is to recognize mismatch and find an open man and capitalize on other teams' mistakes. So and that this guy Drew Holiday was a really good example of that. When Drew Holiday played with the Milwaukee Bucks, he had Giannis Antetokounmpo, he had what was it? Chris Middleton. What's the guy named Portis, and he also had Portis. And so the offense he ran that offense, and the offense ran smooth. And so that's just one part of his job. And now Chris Paul, he'll do that too. He'll have your offense running smooth too, but there's often a lot of friction with Chris Paul and the big men. You hear what was the guy named DeAndre Jordan? There was a lot of friction between Chris Paul and him. What's the other guy? Blake Griffin. There was a lot of friction. DeAndre Ayton, when they played in Phoenix, and they went to they played in the championship against the Bucks and Drew Holiday. And actually, I think Drew Holiday in that series outplayed Chris Paul. When he was with Phoenix, right? Because Drew Holiday, as a true pure point guard, as a leader, do you think he played both? And also, Chris Paul is not really a good defender, right? So when you have somebody Chris Paul, who only played one side of the ball, he's not really a good defender. Um, and typically, like point guards are not really great defenders. They might get like steals or stuff like that. You know what I mean? Like your point guards can get steals, but they're not going to be like on ball defenders. They're not all that great because they have like a size disadvantage, especially Chris Paul. Chris Paul is probably like, they say he's 6'1". So, all right, I'll say he's 6'1". So but a lot of times you can get Chris Paul in a mismatch and take advantage of that, and sometimes you don't even have to set him up and get him into a mismatch because he has to be able to at least stop other guards, and sometimes he wasn't able to stop other guards. Now, somebody like Drew Holiday, he ran the offense on one end, and he is very decent defensive minded on the other end, and that's what you want. You know, that's what you need. You need leadership on one end of the court, and then you need him to be an example of how you want him to play on the defensive end. Drew Holiday also got good rebounds. I mean, he got rebounds and he was a good on-ball defender. And to me, he is a better player and a better leader than than Chris Paul. His job is to keep those big guys happy, make sure that those guys are getting the ball in a place where they can be effective and they can score at. Chris Paul, he did that, but that was the extent of his game. That was the extent of his game. He lacked leadership and he was not really a good defender. And so people say, well, Chris Paul has, and then it's a media thing, in my opinion, because the media, they pick and choose who they want to promote, who they want to uplift. Chris Paul would just so happen to be that guy that they wanted to uplift. When if I had an opportunity, like if I had to choose between Chris Paul and Drew Holiday, I'm going with Drew Holiday. Also, if I had to pick between him and, let's say, somebody like who don't really get a lot of credit, like what's the guy named Tony Parker? I'm going with Tony Parker. Tony Parker, he knew what his responsibilities was. His job was to make sure Manu Ginobili got the ball. He ran the offense, so Manu Ginobili got the ball in his where he could be effective. Tim Duncan, where he could be effective. When people doubled down on Tim Duncan, then somebody like Tony Parker would be able to hit that open shot and make defenses pay. Defenses pay, right? And so Chris Paul, he can score, but he's not. Again, that's another guard, Tony Parker, who I would pick over him, because these guys are pure point guards, and they realize that they lead by example, and they realize that it's not their job to belittle their teammates. And you just hear so much about guys coming out now. Kenyon Martin had a story about Chris Paul said something to him, or had something uh negative to say to him, but Kenyon Martin is not that guy. He's like somebody that you don't want that type of smoke with, because he stands on business, right? Whereas though DeAndre Jordan and Blake Griffin, they probably didn't want to, they knew that if they put hands on them, they probably, they probably hurt them, but they just wanted to, they didn't want no trouble. They didn't want that kind of trouble with beating up, Chris Paul or something like that. So, and that's how a lot of those guys is. Same thing with uh Ayton. DeAndre Ayton, who with the Lakers now. He didn't enjoy playing with Chris Paul because Chris Paul was more so somebody who would tear you down than to bring you up. He think he's motivating you, but the way he go about it is just all wrong. And so people, I just think that, you got to be able to, when you watch the game, you got to know what real leadership is, and don't let the media tell you that, like, oh, Chris Paul is a great point guard. You don't hear these kind of stories, not even about like Jason Kidd. Jason Kidd, you don't hear it about Magic Johnson, like none of the great point guards, you don't hear them. John Stockton playing with who John Stockton played with? Karl Malone. The great point guards. Now, you did, like, Isaiah Thomas was somebody, I don't know, he was somebody who was fiery, you know, but in most cases, you don't hear that about great point guards. You know, you hear those guys, they want. Now, the thing about also with Isaiah Thomas, the offense, he was basically the guy. The offense ran through him. Everybody else, it was almost same thing like with Allen Iverson. He had some scores around him. Joe Dumars could score. Vinny the Microwave could score. But everybody else was just like defense. John Sally, mainly defense. Rick Mahorn, Bill Laimbeer, those guys were defensive guys, you know. So Isaiah was able to get away with that because, you know, like he was exceptional score. And a lot of the points came through Isaiah. You don't, even with what's the other guy? Allen Iverson, when he was in Philly, surrounded with all defensive players. But Allen Iverson, his teammates loved him because he just didn't treat his teammates like that. Now, Allen Iverson was a shoot first guard, so he wasn't a great point guard, but he was the team leader, and he didn't treat his teammates like that, And so, Chris Paul, in my opinion, only played one side of the ball. I think he's overrated. But if you look at what a true point guard is, and you use somebody like Drew Holiday as an example, what the point guard is supposed to do for the team, and you start looking at other point guards, Chris Paul really don't. He really don't measure up to a lot of those guys. He falls short, for what you would need from a point guard on a championship team. And that's why he never won the championship, So that's my take on it. Y'all make sure to like, subscribe. Let me know what you think about, if you agree or disagree. And with that being said, I'll check you all out in the next video. Peace.